What we've seen in the Western world since this pandemic struck has been a demonstration of the destructive power of the state, probably one of the worst outside of what we've seen in armed conflict. And it's probably no surprise that the varying responses to the pandemic throughout different jurisdictions throughout the world have shown the dilemma that's faced by governments, faced by this government in Victoria and governments throughout Australia and throughout the world. And that dilemma is around the balancing of human rights versus control of the pandemic. I remember early in the pandemic, many of us were shocked by the way that some authoritarian regimes were dealing with the pandemic. I note in China, when there was news reports that came out of people's apartment doors being welded shut, people were shocked at what could happen when authoritarian regimes take action against spreading this disease. And in fact, China was very successful in stopping this disease spreading, as were many authoritarian regimes throughout the world. And I hate to think what they did in North Korea, but I imagine it wasn't very good either, but they were probably also quite successful. And so this dilemma that we're presented with of balancing the human rights versus the response to the pandemic is one that Victoria too has had to tackle. And what we're talking when we institute a lockdown, let's be clear, a lockdown is a calculated suppression of the human rights of people within that state. You're taking away their right to move, you're taking away their right to peaceful assembly, you are taking away their right to work. And so, as a response to the pandemic in Victoria, we saw a widespread lockdown, which, although there was lots of talk about science, really a lockdown is quite medieval in nature. We know it will work because we've seen it work throughout history. And we also saw a return to, temporary at least for the moment, the idea of central planning, something that we've seen, discredited through the 20th century. I never thought I'd see production quotas and work permits in my lifetime in Victoria, but we had that recently. But one of the problems with this idea of central planning is that what's really happening is, and the lockdowns, what's really happening is the government is not allowing individuals and businesses to manage risk, and it is assuming risk factors itself. It is saying, here is the risk level that we will accept. And a lockdown is an extremely low level of risk tolerance. Of course it will work. Of course it has worked. But when we are thinking about the human rights aspect, and this is something I'm not convinced of, in fact, in the emergency powers that the government has used, it is quite clear in the legislation that the government must take actions that are proportionate to the risk, that are the least restrictive of human rights. Yet, with all this talk of science, still the evidence underlying these public health directions has not been released to the public. This is not science. Science is about public testing, questioning of assumptions, questioning of decisions. Also, we haven't seen the human rights charter assessments that have been done in association with these public health directions. And so I'm not convinced that the actions that they have taken, of course the lockdown works, but I'm not convinced that they were the least restrictive of rights. And when we look at the effects on businesses, many businesses were screaming out, saying, we can manage these risks. The hospitality sector, many sectors were saying, we have ways and methods of managing this risk. We can come up with systems to manage this risk. And they weren't allowed to manage that risk because one of the downsides of central planning, of course, is that it's a very blunt instrument. The people, the bureaucrats at the top, cannot see the detail and the information necessary to manage risk at that micro level. Only the individuals and the businesses managing their own systems can see those details that are necessary to manage that risk. And so the response from a lot of these businesses was bewilderment because it didn't make sense to them. And I can give you some real examples of this. So we heard, and of course, I'm sure many of you were contacted by these businesses, and they were, I'm sure they gave you stories as well of bewilderment. But we heard from accountants. Now, accountants were very busy during this pandemic period because businesses had a lot of financial matters that they needed to fix. And what they wanted to do was help their clients understand all the grants and payments that are available, but they were prohibited from going to their office to access hard copies. Now, an accountant going to an office by himself to access some paperwork would seem to present almost zero risk, but of course it was not, they weren't allowed to manage that risk, and so they were prevented from doing that. We also saw small business owners who they wanted to utilise this downtime. They had some upgrades and repairs scheduled. They thought it might be a good idea if, while they're not able to conduct business, they would go in by themselves and start doing these upgrades and repairs on their business. Again, they would have been by themselves, but they weren't allowed to do it. They were prevented from doing that. In fact, they were informed that they may attract a fine of $100,000. Landscape gardeners, people who go out by themselves, working by themselves outdoors, you would think is an extremely low risk. Again, they were caught up in this blunt hammer instrument of the centrally planned lockdown, and again, they weren't allowed to work. So we saw all of this economic activity suppressed that, to any sort of reasonable assessment, didn't actually present a major risk of disease transmission. And there's numerous examples of these. And then when these business people dissent, and many of them did dissent because it didn't make sense to them, these restrictions didn't make sense to them, they were demonised. And in fact, we saw only a few weeks ago, it seems like a million years ago now, but back on Cup Day at that protest where I went along to listen to what people had to say, I heard from a lot of the people there were small business owners who were upset. There were people there who lost their jobs. They were upset with the government and they wanted to show that they were upset. In fact, one story, there was one woman there, it was Cup Day, she was wearing a fascinator. And I asked her, I said, I know it's Cup Day and you can't go to the Cup and you're wearing a fascinator. Like, this seems like a strange thing to be wearing to a protest. And her response was, she met a lady on the street, her business was selling these for Cup Day. No one was allowed to have parties, no one was allowed to have, to go out anywhere. And this lady was on the street giving away the fascinators to people. She was crying apparently. I didn't see this lady myself. She was giving them away because she didn't want them to go to waste. And this woman wore one as a sign of support for this woman whose business was destroyed by the lockdown. And rather than attempt to respect the right to peaceful assembly that these people had who were upset with the government's response, what did the government do? How did the government respond to these people? They surrounded them by police, they compressed them into a tiny space, making a total mockery of the idea that they were there to prevent the spread of disease. They kept them there for hours outside, and then when they complained that they needed to go to the toilet, they were dragged away for being upset. And when they complained that they were thirsty, they were given water out of a communal bucket that they borrowed from the pub. This makes a mockery of the entire idea that they were there to prevent public health. And then they took 400 of those people. I estimate there was probably about 1,500 people there originally, but by the stage, the people that got kettled, there was about 400 of them. They arrested and gave every one of them a fine. I think the reason that it took so long is because their computer systems weren't working properly. They took me away to give me a fine, which I still haven't received. They said they couldn't give it to me on the spot because their computer system wasn't working very well. I think that's probably the reason that they were there for so long and it took such a long time. So we have a sub-performance computer system which has taken away the freedoms of Victorians who were trying to exercise their right to peaceful assembly for hours. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. And so, you know, and this is typical. I mean, every time any sort of questioning of the government has happened, this false dichotomy has been presented. And even today, they're doing it again. You know, if anyone questions the budget, they're saying, oh, well, what would you, the Premier said, what would you want? You know, do you want austerity? It's like there's this black and white, it's like there's no middle ground on anything. And when you question the lockdowns, people say, oh, do you want to just let it rip? There's these false dichotomies set up all the time to demonise any sort of questioning or dissent. We need, in the future, what I hope in the future is that we will learn to deal with these things in a more sophisticated way, in a way that respects human rights better, and in a way that reflects our tradition as a liberal democracy. Now, Ms. Xing was talking about how you know, we were more heavily impacted because we have, you know, a visitor economy and we're highly dependent on the education sector, especially foreign students, and this is absolutely true. But we're in this sort of stage now where people are talking as if it's, you know, mission accomplished. But our borders are still closed. This visitor economy and the foreign students, I fear that what Ms. Xing is saying, she's referring to the past. Is that going to be our future? I mean, how can we actually open up in the current state, allow these people back into our state to go to university, to see our beautiful landscape and to see our cities while the borders are closed? If there's no medical treatment that will prevent or cure the illness, I don't see how this is a sustainable state of affairs at all. And what happens if we find out that, you know, maybe this vaccine that we're talking about isn't as effective as they hope, or maybe it's not as safe as they hope, or maybe distribution, you know, I mean, just the act of producing of the vast number of these things could take years. We don't know how long these are going to take. How long are we going to remain like this? So what I'd like to say is that I hope that in the future that people look at what the government has done critically, that we find ways to defend human rights, and I've been very upset with the lack of defence of human rights up to this point in the pandemic. I hope that we can find ways to defend human rights in the future, and that the pandemic responses will be reflective of our traditions of liberal democracy and the fact that we are a free society and not an authoritarian regime. Thank you.